Welcome. I'm so glad you could join me today for this lesson on the history of the United States during the 1800s. A lot happened during the 1800s as the United States quickly grew from the original 13 states. By the end of the 1800s, the United States would stretch all the way from the Atlantic Ocean in the east to the Pacific Ocean in the west. The first major expansion of the United States happened in 1803, when President Thomas Jefferson decided the country should expand. He purchased a large piece of land called the Louisiana Territory from France for $15 million. This purchase doubled the size of the United States. This new territory was very large, extending from the Mississippi River toward the territory that would eventually become Montana and Wyoming. President Jefferson wanted to learn about what this new land was like, so he sent some men to explore this new land. The men spent 2 years exploring, and eventually made it all the way to the west coast. Along the way, they studied the plants and animals, and made maps of the territory. They also met many new American Indian tribes in this new territory. The 1800s were filled with many challenges for the United States, both inside the country and outside. Some of these challenges led to more wars with Great Britain, Mexico, and Spain. Later in the 1800s, a long civil war broke out between the northern and southern states. As we study the 1800s, we will go over 4 different wars that happened. The War of 1812, and the Mexican-American War happened during the first half of the 1800s. Then the Civil War broke out in the 1860s, and the Spanish-American War happened toward the end of the century, in 1898. In the early 1800s, the United States was still continuing to have many problems with Great Britain. The British Navy interrupted U.S. trade with other countries, capturing U.S. ships and forcing their sailors to work for the British. Britain also encouraged Native American tribes to fight with American settlers who were moving to the west. All of this led to the War of 1812, which continued until 1815, when the two countries agreed to stop the fighting. In the 1840s, Mexico and the United States had disputes about where the southern border was. President James Polk wanted to continue America's expansion westward, so he sent U.S. soldiers to occupy the lands to the west. When Mexicans in that land attacked the U.S. soldiers, the United States declared war against Mexico. The war continued from 1846 to 1848, when the two countries signed a peace treaty. According to the treaty, the U.S. now took possession of land all the way to the Pacific Ocean. In 1861, a dark chapter in American history began, as a civil war broke out between the northern and the southern states. In the South, there were many who wanted their states to be a separate country. They formed the Confederate States of America, or what was called the Confederacy. Most people in the North supported the federal government, and wanted to remain a single united country. The war saw many thousands of people die on both sides, and continued until 1865 when the Confederate Army finally surrendered to the Union Army. In 1898, the United States once again went to war. This time, The fight was with Spain, in the Spanish-American War. The U.S. came to the aid of Cuba, because the U.S. wanted Cuba to be independent from Spain, due to some economic interests in Cuba. When a U.S. ship was attacked near Cuba, many believed the Spanish were responsible. Because of this, the U.S. declared war against Spain. The U.S. won the war by the end of 1898. After the war, Cuba became independent, and the United States gained the territories of Guam, Puerto Rico, and other islands, as part of the terms of the treaty. In the second half of our lesson on U.S. history in the 1800s, we're going to take a closer look at the economic and political circumstances that led to the Civil War, and we will take a closer look at the contributions of Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president. Since the early days of the American colonies, millions of African people were abducted and taken to North America, where they were sold into slavery. The majority of the slaves went to the southern states, which was mostly an agricultural economy. There, plantation owners used them as cheap laborers that were not paid for their work. Slaves were treated very poorly by the plantation owners, who regarded the slaves like pieces of personal property. Slaves were auctioned and sold across the South at places like this auction hall, in Atlanta, Georgia. Even though they were in America, the slaves had no freedom or even basic rights. They were not treated as people. They could not decide where they wanted to live, and they usually did not receive any formal education. In the northern states, many people did not agree with slavery. Slaves would often escape from their owners in the South, and make the dangerous journey to the northern states and Canada to find freedom. The Southern economy grew dependent on slave labor over the years. This was one of the primary causes of the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln was President of the United States during the Civil War. When 11 Southern states voted to form a new separate country, they cited their dependence on slaves, economic reasons, and the rights of the states to make their own laws. Lincoln said that they could not separate from the Union, because it was against the Constitution. He stopped the Southern states from dividing the country, and so, war broke out. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves in the Southern states. After that, thousands of African Americans served with the Union Army to help defeat the Confederacy. By the time the war ended in 1865, over 3 million Americans fought on both sides, and more than 600,000 people died in the war.
President Lincoln did some amazing things, didn't he?
Indeed he did. The Emancipation Proclamation led to the 13th Amendment being added in December of 1865. This amendment ended slavery in every state. And then in 1868, black people became citizens of the United States, and in 1870, black men got the right to vote. Sadly, Lincoln did not get to witness any of these important historical milestones, as he was shot and killed on April 14, 1865.
That's terrible. He'd done so much for the country, and for people's freedoms.
Yes, he did. But unfortunately, the fight for equality in America was far from over, as we will discuss more in a future lesson on equality and freedom. But these changes were so important, without a doubt. I feel like we've covered a lot of information in this lesson. Would you mind leading us in a review of the civics test questions covered in this lesson?
Sure. I'd be happy to. We covered a number of civics test questions in this lesson, so let's review those now. What territory did the United States buy from France in 1803? The Louisiana Territory. Name one war fought by the United States in the 1800s. You can answer any of the following. War of 1812. Mexican-American War. Civil War. Or the Spanish-American War. What group of people was taken to America and sold as slaves? Africans, people from Africa. Name the U.S. war between the North and the South. The Civil War, or the war between the states. Name one problem that led to the Civil War. Slavery. Economic reasons. States' rights. What was one important thing that Abraham Lincoln did? Freed the slaves. Emancipation Proclamation. Saved or preserved the Union. Led the United States during the Civil War. What did the Emancipation Proclamation do? You can answer any one of the following. Freed the slaves. Freed slaves in the Confederacy, or the Confederate States. Freed slaves in most southern states.
Well, that's it for this lesson. Feel free to come back anytime to review the material, where you can go over the civics test questions using the flashcards. We hope to see you again for a future lesson. Goodbye for now.